and scenarios. Really? They published a paper on purpose, and it was just fiction. Does the government really do that? I don't believe that for a minute. Now, the Air Force further clarified that in 2005, the paper does not reflect current military policy, practice, or capability, and that it is not conducting any weather modification experiments or programs and has no need to do so in the future. So let me get this straight. The government and Air University put out a paper called Weather as a Force Multiplier, Owning the Weather in 2025. And when they asked them about it, they said, well, that was just a hoax. That was just a joke. That was just a fictional account. Oh, and by the way, we're not doing that anymore and don't plan on doing it. Well, why would you say you're not going to do it anymore if you said you never did it? That, my friends, is fishy, to say the least. Now, other proponents of the chemtrail conspiracy theory tend to say that chemtrails can be distinguished by the contrails by their long duration, asserting that the chemtrails left by those aircraft, they persist as long as a half a day and transform into cloud or cirrus-like clouds. Proponents claim that after 1995, contrails had a different chemical composition and lasted a whole lot longer. Proponents characterize chemtrails as streams that persist for hours and that with their crisscross grid-like or parallel stripe patterns eventually blend into large crowds. Also leading to the theory of chemtrails is photos have been released of barrels installed inside passenger space of aircraft for test flight purposes. And the proponents of chemtrails claim that shows an aerosol dispersion system. Now, the government says the real purpose of those barrels is to simulate the weight of passengers or cargo. The barrels are filled with water, and the water can be pumped from barrel to barrel in order to test different centers of gravity while the aircraft is in flight. And I've seen these photographs, and they may in fact be the barrels that the guys are talking about, but they do look suspicious. They do look fishy. And this is a deal where, where there's smoke, there's fire, and that's why people think that. Chemtrail believers also interpret the existence of cloud seeding programs and research into climate engineering as evidence of this conspiracy. Now, what are cloud seeders? Well, if it needs to rain, you seed the clouds. You do things up in space or up in the sky to make it rain. They've been doing this for years. There's different chemicals they may seed the clouds with. Just this week in, I want to say Dubai or the UAE, someplace, one of the big Middle Eastern countries, the temperature hit 120 degrees, and they needed to do something to cool things off. So they sent drones into clouds and let off electrical discharges. And it caused the clouds to let forth water, and it rained. It poured and cooled down the temperature. They're doing it in the Middle East, folks. Cloud seeding is a real thing. And spraying clouds with stuff via airplane is also a real thing. Let's take this one step further, and then we'll be done. Then we'll be done with just the part one of this, talking about chemtrails. Back in 2001, in response to requests from constituents, U.S. Congressman Dennis Kucinich, I believe he's from the Cleveland area in Ohio, introduced but did not author House Resolution 2977, the Space Preservation Act of 2001, that would have permanently prohibited that basing weapons in space, listing chemicals as one of the number of exotic weapons, would be banned. Now, proponents have interpreted that this explicit reference to chemtrails as government acknowledged their existence. Specifics note that the bill in question also mentions extraterrestrial weapons and environmental climate or tectonic weapons. Now, the bill received an unfavorable evaluation from the U.S. Department of Defense, and it died in committee with no mention of chemtrails appearing in the text of any of the 30 subsequent failed attempts by Kucinich to enact a Space Preservation Act. So a U.S. congressman thought this was so important that he tried to introduce a bill 3 separate times. Okay, so you're saying to yourself, okay, Strong, all you've said is as much kooks And you may or may not include Dennis Kucinich, U.S. congressman, as one of those kooks. Whole bunch of kooks that are just saying, okay, there's a few little things here that the government may or may not have done. And right away you're thinking, okay, so the government's spraying us with chemicals. Okay. Have you ever heard of Operation LAC? That's an acronym for Operation LAC, LAC. That's an acronym for Large Area Coverage. Well, this is a fact. In fact, this was a United States Army Chemical Corps operation which dispersed microscopic zinc cadmium sulfide particles over much of the United States and into Canada in order to test dispersal patterns and geographic range of chemicals or biological weapons. Now, there were several tests that occurred prior to the first spraying affiliated with Operation LAC that proved the concept of large area coverage. Some of those included September 1950. And again, this is from the U.S. government. They're admitting that they did this. September 1950, 6 simulated attacks were conducted upon the San Francisco Bay Area, and it was concluded that it was feasible to attack a seaport city with biological aerosol agents from a ship offshore. Between March and April 1952, 5 trials were conducted off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia under what they called Operation Dew. It was concluded that long-range aerosol clouds could obtain hundreds of miles of travel and large area coverage when disseminated from ground level under certain meteorological conditions. In 1957, in the North Sea, the east coast of Britain, it was shown that large area coverage with particles was feasible under most meteorological conditions. In addition to that, the Army admitted to spraying in Minnesota locations from 1953 into 1960. And here's the caveat, and I've talked about this one before. In St. Louis, in the mid-1950s and again a decade later, the Army sprayed zinc cadmium sulfide via motorized blowers atop the Pruitt-Igoe housing project, at schools, from the backs of station wagons, and via airplanes. The government has admitted to this. Now, Operation LAC was undertaken back in 1957 and 1958 by the Army U.S. Chemical Corps, and the operation involved spraying large areas of zinc cadmium sulfide. How did they do it? Well, the U.S. Air Force loaned the Army a C-119 flying boxcar, and it was used to disperse the minerals by the ton in the atmosphere over the United States. The first test occurred back in December 2nd, 1957, along a path from South Dakota to International Falls, Minnesota. The tests were designed to determine the dispersion and geographic range of biological or chemical agents. Stations on the ground tracked fluorescent zinc cadmium sulfide particles. They tracked them, okay? There was also another test. This was the same test, part of the same test. December 2nd, 1957, The test was incomplete due to a mass of cold air that came down from Canada, and it carried the particles from their drop point and then took a turn northeast, taking most of the particles into Canada. However, some of the particles showed up 1,200 miles away in New York State. Now, according to Leonard A. Cole, a Army Chemical Corps, According to Leonard A. Cole, who's an Army Chemical Corps document, he entitled Summary of the Main Events and Problems Described the Scope of Operation LAC, Cole documented that the tests were the largest ever undertaken by the Chemical Corps in the United States. It went from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic Ocean, up into Canada, down to the Gulf of Mexico, especially the Midwestern United States. Now, what else do they spray? I'm probably going to butcher this word, but it's called Bacillus globigli. Bacillus, and then it's spelled Globigii. That was also used to simulate biological warfare agents, such as anthrax. Now, it's not nearly as bad as anthrax, but they considered this bacteria a contaminant with little health consequence to humans. However, BG, which is what they call it, is now considered a human pathogen, so they don't do it anymore. Now, anecdotal evidence exists that zinc cadmium sulfide causing adverse health effects is a result of the LAC program. However, a U.S. government study done by the U.S. Research Council stated, in part, that after an exhaustive independent review requested by Congress, we found no evidence that exposure to zinc cadmium sulfide at these levels could cause people to become sick. Even still, the use of zinc cadmium sulfide remains controversial, and one critic accused the Army of literally using the country as an experimental laboratory. Although, according to the National Library of Medicine's ToxNet database, the EPA reported that cadmium sulfide was classified as a probable human carcinogen. Very interesting. We touched on the St. Louis spraying, and I've talked about this before. And there was an article in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch that I uncovered from November 12th, 2012. Again, from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. There was a doctoral dissertation that renewed public interest in the military-sponsored chemical spraying of impoverished areas in St. Louis in the 50s and 60s, and it spawned a lawsuit. Still not sure how that lawsuit turned out, but it leaves open the potential for litigation related to some more controversial aspects of the work. And there was a work done by Lisa Martino Taylor, and she was the author of this, and she questions a more sinister government experiment on human test subjects as just the zinc cadmium sulfide. Now, it's undisputed. What is undisputed is that St. Louis was among several test cities chosen decades ago by the government contractors for spraying zinc cadmium sulfide, a chemical powder, mixed with fluorescent particles to allow tracking of dispersal patterns. They did it. They've admitted it. Now, the spraying was part of a biological weapons program the government succeeded in 1994. And St. Louis was chosen because its topography was similar to some Russian cities the military thought it might have to attack. So in other words, we may need to biologically attack Russian cities. St. Louis is similar to some of these cities topologically, so let's use them as a guinea pig. Now, when Ms. Martino Taylor's research hit the news earlier in the fall of 2012, it triggered a memory of Benjamin Phillips, who's currently the sole plaintiff in what his attorney seeks in turn as to be a class action lawsuit in the St. Louis Circuit Court. Now, Phillips, who's a former city marshal, spent part of his childhood in the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex. He suddenly remembered men in protective suits on roofs with machines spewing what seemed like a thick fog of bug spray, according to his attorney, Elkin Kistner. Now, residents were told it was testing a smoke screen for protection against enemy attacks. So they just lied. Now, Ms. Martino Taylor's research highlighted studies showing chronic lung and respiratory problems born from the exposure to zinc cadmium sulfide. The Army said earlier in the month, in November 2012, that no health consequences had been found in St. Louis. Now, Ms. Martino Taylor also raised the possibility of radioactive materials being used. She points to the link between participants in the St. Louis program and the scientists who took part in warfare efforts to build the atomic bomb. The Army denied such speculation. Now, Phillips' suit generally describes the spraying of cadmium, including the potentially radioactive cadmium, without the knowledge or consent of these residents. So maybe it just wasn't zinc cadmium sulfate, but maybe it was radioactive cadmium. Cadmium, by the way, is a big deal. It's a very toxic chemical. Once upon a time, they used to use it for plating. They don't use it anymore because it's a carcinogen. They use zinc now. Now, it names defendants as the Parsons Company, and that's a government contractor known to have conducted the tests, and two others that Ms. Martino Taylor named as potential players based on government records. SRI International, which supposedly designed an air sampling unit to be used in the aerosol studies, and Monsanto,